Most wars are remembered because of a single famous battle. But sometimes history changes long before the final shot is fired. In 1777, the British Empire launched what seemed like the perfect military campaign. On paper, every advantage belonged to Britain. Its army was experienced, its officers were confident, and its empire possessed resources that no colony could hope to match. Yet within a few months, that same army would be surrounded, starving, and forced to surrender in one of the greatest military disasters Britain had ever experienced. The road to that defeat did not begin with one terrible battle. It began with a series of decisions that looked reasonable at the time, but slowly trapped an entire army hundreds of miles from safety. By the beginning of 1777, Britain believed the American Revolution was nearing its end. The previous year's victories had forced George Washington and the Continental Army into repeated retreats. Many American soldiers had completed their enlistments and returned home. Money had lost much of its value, supplies were running dangerously low, and confidence inside the colonies was fading. Across the Atlantic, British politicians believed the rebellion had only survived because it had not yet received one decisive blow. Their solution appeared simple. Instead of chasing American forces across different colonies, Britain would divide the rebellion in two. Military planners focused on the Hudson River Valley, one of North America's most important natural corridors. Whoever controlled this route could separate New England from the southern colonies, making communication and cooperation almost impossible. The strategy required several armies to move at the same time. One force would advance northward from New York City. Another would move east through the Mohawk Valley. The largest army would march south from Canada, clearing everything in its path before meeting the other British forces near Albany. If everything happened according to schedule, the colonies would be split apart, and organized resistance might collapse. It was an ambitious plan. Its greatest weakness was that every part depended on perfect coordination. The commander selected to lead the northern invasion was Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. He was respected, intelligent, and admired inside British political circles. Burgoyne believed discipline, planning, and confidence could overcome almost any obstacle. He expected the campaign to become the defining achievement of his career. During the early summer of 1777, thousands of British regulars, German auxiliaries, Loyalist volunteers, engineers, artillery crews, and native allies assembled in Canada. It was an impressive army. Heavy cannon accompanied the columns. Supply wagons stretched for remarkable distances. Food, ammunition, engineering equipment, and military stores followed behind the marching soldiers. Everything suggested that Britain was preparing not merely to win a campaign, but to demonstrate the overwhelming strength of the empire. The opening weeks appeared to justify that confidence. British troops captured one American position after another, forcing defenders to abandon valuable supplies and withdraw farther south. Reports of these victories crossed the Atlantic and encouraged British leaders. Many believed the remaining campaign would simply continue in the same direction. But victories can sometimes hide dangerous problems. Every mile Burgoyne advanced increased the distance between his army and its supply bases in Canada. Unlike Europe, northern New York offered almost no developed road network. Dense forests covered the landscape. Marshes interrupted travel. Rivers demanded bridges. Rain transformed narrow tracks into deep mud. American commanders quickly realized they could not match Britain's professional army in open battle. Instead of fighting where the British were strongest, they attacked the campaign itself. Trees crashed across roads. Bridges disappeared. Streams flooded low ground. Food was removed before British soldiers could reach nearby settlements. Livestock vanished. Grain stores were emptied. Even simple travel became exhausting. Engineers worked from sunrise until darkness, only to clear a few miles of road. Heavy cannon frequently became trapped in mud. Wagons overturned. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Progress slowed dramatically. The British Army still possessed discipline and firepower, but discipline could not shorten the wilderness. As the advance continued, American militia units became increasingly active. They avoided large battles. Instead, they waited for isolated patrols. Supply wagons became favorite targets. Messengers disappeared. Small groups of soldiers collecting food often returned under fire, or failed to return at all. These constant attacks forced Burgoyne to devote more men to protecting supplies than advancing toward his objective. The invasion slowly lost momentum. Then public opinion inside the colonies shifted in an unexpected way. News spread rapidly about the death of a young woman named Jane McCrea. Although historians continue debating exactly what happened, the incident shocked colonial communities. Stories surrounding her death spread through newspapers and word of mouth with incredible speed. Many people who had remained undecided suddenly viewed the British advance as a direct threat to their families and homes. Recruitment surged, militia companies expanded. Communities that had hesitated only weeks earlier now prepared for war. While Burgoyne struggled to move south, American resistance grew larger every day. Soon another crisis emerged: food shortages. Thousands of soldiers required enormous quantities of supplies every single day. Horses needed grain. Artillery teams required fresh animals. Without secure transportation, shortages became unavoidable. To solve the problem, Burgoyne authorized an expedition toward the settlement of Bennington. The objective was straightforward: capture livestock, collect horses, seize food and wagons, return before American forces could react. British intelligence suggested only light resistance. Reality proved completely different. Local militia had already gathered in significant numbers. Instead of finding scattered civilians, the expedition encountered determined defenders who knew every hill, forest path, and stream in the surrounding countryside. The fighting quickly turned chaotic. American units attacked from multiple directions, preventing the British and German troops from organizing an effective defense. Attempts to regroup were disrupted by fresh militia arriving throughout the day. When the battle ended, the losses were severe. Hundreds of experienced soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Even worse, the expedition failed to secure the supplies it had been sent to collect. The victory transformed American confidence. Farmers who had never considered themselves soldiers now believed Britain could be defeated. Volunteers arrived from neighboring colonies carrying personal muskets and whatever equipment they could gather. The Continental Army was no longer standing alone. It was being reinforced by ordinary citizens determined to stop the invasion. Meanwhile, Burgoyne received increasingly troubling news. The supporting army expected from the west had failed to reach him. Operations that were supposed to strengthen the northern campaign had broken down. Even more alarming was the silence coming from the south. The army expected to march north from New York never appeared. Instead, British commanders pursued different objectives hundreds of miles away. Whether caused by miscommunication or conflicting priorities, the result remained the same. Burgoyne's army now stood deep inside hostile territory without the support that had formed the foundation of the original strategy. At this moment, retreat remained possible. The road back to Canada was difficult, but still open. Returning north would preserve thousands of soldiers for future campaigns. Continuing south promised glory, but also enormous risk. For Burgoyne, withdrawing would mean admitting that the carefully planned invasion had failed. He refused to accept that conclusion. His army crossed the Hudson River and continued toward Albany. With every mile, escape became more difficult. Ahead, American commanders selected one of the strongest defensive positions available. High ridges overlooked the surrounding countryside. Forests protected the flanks. Defensive earthworks strengthened every important approach. More importantly, fresh militia continued arriving almost daily. The balance of power had changed. The British still possessed professional soldiers. The Americans now possessed superior numbers, strong defensive terrain, and growing confidence. Neither side fully realized it yet, but the decisive stage of the Saratoga Campaign was about to begin. The coming battles would determine far more than the fate of one British army. They would influence whether the American Revolution survived or disappeared before the world ever believed it had a chance. By the middle of September 1777, both armies understood that a decisive confrontation could no longer be avoided. The British had marched too far to retreat without admitting failure. The Americans had gathered enough strength to challenge an army that only months earlier had appeared unstoppable. Between them lay fields, forests, and narrow clearings that would soon become some of the most important ground in American history. Burgoyne knew time was no longer working in his favor. His supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back toward Canada. Every wagon had to travel dangerous roads. Every convoy risked attack. Every delay meant fewer supplies reaching exhausted soldiers. He needed a breakthrough before hunger defeated his army. The Americans had different priorities. Their commanders understood they did not need a spectacular victory. If they prevented the British from advancing, shortages and isolation would slowly weaken the invading force. Sometimes patience can become the most powerful weapon on a battlefield. As British columns advanced through wooded terrain, they encountered determined resistance. Dense forests broke formations that had been perfected on European battlefields. Orders became difficult to hear. Smoke drifted between the trees. Visibility disappeared. Officers often relied on instinct rather than clear communication. American riflemen used the landscape to their advantage. Instead of standing in long lines, they moved through cover, selecting important targets and forcing British officers to operate under constant pressure. Every advance demanded a heavy price. When British infantry captured a position, fresh American units appeared from another direction. Ground gained after hours of fighting was often lost only minutes later. Neither side could claim an easy victory. But the difference lay in replacement. The Americans continued receiving volunteers. The British did not. Every experienced soldier lost was a loss that could not easily be repaired. When the fighting paused, Burgoyne hoped help would finally arrive. He expected reinforcements from the south. He expected supplies to catch up. He expected circumstances to improve. None of those hopes became reality. Instead, the American camp continued growing. Militia companies arrived carrying their own weapons and provisions. Local communities willingly supported the army with food, labor, and intelligence. British scouts reported increasing enemy numbers almost every day. Inside Burgoyne's camp, rations became smaller. Many horses were too weak to continue pulling artillery. Soldiers spent long nights repairing damaged equipment while rain soaked tents and supplies. Confidence slowly gave way to uncertainty. The campaign that had begun with celebrations now became a struggle for survival. Early in October, Burgoyne decided that waiting any longer would only make defeat more likely. He ordered a reconnaissance force forward, hoping to discover a weakness in the American defenses. Instead, the movement triggered another major battle. American commanders reacted quickly. Units advanced from several directions, placing intense pressure on the British line. The fighting became confused almost immediately. Gunfire echoed through forests already scarred by weeks of campaigning. Artillery thundered across open ground. Smoke covered the battlefield. Communication broke down. Small groups of soldiers often fought without knowing what was happening only a few hundred yards away. During the battle, one American officer displayed extraordinary determination. Benedict Arnold had spent much of the campaign frustrated by disagreements with senior leadership. But once the fighting intensified, he focused entirely on the battlefield. Ignoring personal danger, he rode wherever the fighting became most intense. He encouraged wavering units. He redirected attacks. He inspired soldiers simply by appearing where resistance was strongest. His leadership added fresh momentum to the American assault. Gradually, British positions began collapsing. Important defensive works changed hands. Entire sections of the British line withdrew under relentless pressure. During one attack, Arnold suffered a devastating leg wound after his horse fell beneath him. The injury nearly ended his military career. Yet his actions helped drive the American advance forward at one of the campaign's most critical moments. For Burgoyne, the situation had become impossible. His army could no longer hold its forward positions. As darkness approached, he ordered a retreat toward the north. Retreat, however, proved almost as dangerous as battle. Heavy rain transformed roads into deep mud. Broken wagons blocked narrow routes. Wounded soldiers struggled to keep pace. Abandoned equipment marked the path of the withdrawing army. American forces followed relentlessly. Militia moved through forests to seize crossroads ahead of the retreating columns. Escape routes disappeared one after another. Within days, Burgoyne realized his army had become trapped. American troops surrounded the remaining British positions. Artillery dominated nearby heights. Sharpshooters made movement dangerous even inside the camp. Food supplies were almost exhausted. Ammunition had to be conserved. The possibility of breaking through American lines grew smaller with every passing hour. British officers understood the reality before them. Continuing the fight would sacrifice thousands of lives without changing the outcome. Negotiations began. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne formally surrendered his army. Thousands of British and German soldiers laid down their weapons after months of exhausting campaigning. For Britain, the surrender represented far more than the loss of one army. It shattered the belief that the rebellion could be crushed quickly. News crossed the Atlantic with astonishing speed. European governments watched carefully. Among them, France paid particularly close attention. For months, French leaders had secretly supported the American cause with supplies and financial assistance while avoiding direct war with Britain. The victory at Saratoga changed everything. If American forces could defeat and capture an entire British field army, then the revolution no longer appeared hopeless. It appeared possible. In early 1778, France officially recognized the United States and entered the conflict as its ally. French money strengthened the struggling American government. French warships challenged British naval power across the Atlantic. French soldiers later fought beside American forces during campaigns that eventually led to victory at Yorktown. The conflict was no longer a colonial rebellion. It had become an international war. Britain now faced powerful enemies across multiple oceans. The consequences reached far beyond the force of New York. For Burgoyne personally, the defeat ended his military ambitions. Questions were asked in Parliament. Decisions made before and during the campaign came under intense scrutiny. Responsibility was debated for years. Some blamed poor communication between British commanders. Others pointed to impossible logistics, difficult terrain, and underestimating American determination. In truth, the campaign failed because several problems combined into one disaster. Long supply lines, poor coordination, difficult geography, growing American resistance, strategic misunderstandings. None of them alone guaranteed defeat. Together, they became impossible to overcome. The campaign also left a lasting mark on Benedict Arnold. Although his courage earned admiration from many soldiers, recognition never matched his expectations. Frustration and resentment continued growing after the victory. Only a few years later, Arnold would betray the nation he had fought so fiercely to defend. His name eventually became synonymous with treason, overshadowing the extraordinary bravery he displayed during the Saratoga Campaign. History often remembers people for their final decisions rather than their greatest achievements. The surrender at Saratoga remains one of those rare moments when the outcome of a single campaign changed the direction of an entire war. Had Burgoyne reached Albany, British strategy might have unfolded very differently. Had the American defense collapsed, foreign governments might never have risked supporting the revolution. Instead, one failed invasion convinced the world that Britain could be defeated. The United States gained more than a battlefield victory. It gained international credibility. That credibility brought powerful allies, expanded resources, and renewed hope when independence was still far from certain. Generations later, historians continue to study Saratoga, not because it involved the largest armies or the bloodiest fighting, but because it demonstrated a timeless lesson. Military strength alone cannot guarantee victory. An army without secure supplies, reliable coordination, and realistic objectives can lose even when it begins with every apparent advantage. In the forests and hills of northern New York, an empire discovered that confidence is never a substitute for strategy. And from that moment forward, the American Revolution was no longer merely a fight for survival. It had become a war the world could no longer ignore.